International Cultic Studies Association, helping people since 1979. About ICSA. Founded in 1979, the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA, is a global network of people concerned about psychological manipulation and abuse in cultic and other high-control environments. ICSA is tax-exempt, supports civil liberties, and is not affiliated with any religious or commercial organizations. Our mission. ICSA provides information, education, and help to those affected by or interested in cultic and other high-control groups and relationships. Join or donate today at icsahome.com/membership. Disclaimer. Views expressed on ICSA websites or in ICSA's publications or events are those of the document's author or speaker and are not necessarily shared, endorsed, or recommended by ICSA or any of its directors, staff, or advisors. Reverend Dr. Neil Damgaard is originally from the Washington, D.C. area. A graduate of Virginia Tech, he worked for the U.S. Navy under contract as a management engineering consultant. After entering the ministry in 1976, he later graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary with a 4-year Master's of Theology degree in Historical Theology and served on staff at churches in Virginia and Texas, and then as senior pastor of the Dartmouth Bible Church in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts from 1983 to 2019. With an interest in students and young adults and long experience with them, Pastor Neil also served as Protestant Chaplain with the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, 2007 to 2019. He also earned his Doctor of Ministry degree in 2008 from Dallas Theological Seminary. Neil holds an endless fascination with history, culture, architecture, music, and film. He has authored 2 books, A History of Dartmouth Bible Church, 1963 to 2013, and Defiance at Cairo, 2020. He is from the editor of ICSA's Wounded Faith, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse. Now retired, he lives in Roanoke, Virginia, and has been married to Renée, a retired public school, high school math teacher since 1975. Today, they have raised 2 daughters, Jocelyn, a mechanical engineer and intellectual property focal for Boeing Aircraft, and a wife and mother of 2 living in Denver, and Susanna, a graduate of Messiah College and Yale University, who is a registered nurse in Los Angeles, California.
Did you, so when these people came to you, I'm assuming it's a little bit like when they come to my church. It's word of mouth, group of survivors from one church talk to each other and say, hey, we found a place that, is good for us and we're liking it. Why don't you come and check it out with us? What do you think, it's okay if you brag a little bit about it. What do you think they found in your ministry that made them want to come back the next Sunday and maybe bring their fellow survivors? What was it about your group, your church?
It was different with each one. In the last group, I personally did not know any of the people. In the first 2 groups, I knew people previously. They'd had some acquaintance with me through one ministry or another. They knew about us. And when they came to us to explore a new place, our people responded as they did. I think that none of it was organized. As I say, it wasn't planned. The last one was planned, that we didn't know anybody previously. But the first 2, it was spontaneous, and they were just looking for some place to go. And they knew about us by word of mouth or our reputation. New England, Southern New England is 2/3 Roman Catholic. Okay. And so Protestantism is a little more high visibility among all of the churches. There's a very old Protestant tradition there too, congregationalism and so forth. But there just aren't that many churches, unlike other parts of the country, including where I live now, where there are churches everywhere, Protestant churches everywhere. But there in southeastern Massachusetts, Catholicism has been dominant for 150 years and still is, really. So when people would go out looking for something new, there aren't that many choices. And so our people were pretty receptive, I think. as New Englanders characteristically are. It can be a little standoffish, but we were all New Englanders together. So, folks would come in, and I don't want to. None of it came out of cults. The integration of people who are coming out of a high-profile abusive cult, that we saw some of that, but not in an organized way. The organized groups of people who were migrating were from conservative churches, and that was a little disorienting for us. Well, wait a minute, you're from a sister church, down the road a ways. You're not supposed to have been abused. You're not supposed to be bleeding and broken and everything. That was disorienting for us. But there was some aberrant, and that's a good word, I think. There was some aberrant feature in what they'd experienced in their previous home that had compelled them to leave. I see.
So when they came, thank you, Neil. When they came to your church, did their healing process take place in your church as you recognized them as a distinct group, maybe a trauma bonded group of people? Or did they just kind of scatter and melt their way into the programs and processes of your church? When you were helping them and when your church was learning how to absorb and understand their experience, did they stay a group in themselves? I'm asking this for myself a little bit. Did they stay a group, or did they just kind of move out into your ministry and the lives of your congregants?
The first two groups were aware of each other, their fellowship. They were connected, obviously, previously to each other, and knew each other very well. But there was no organization to it. There was no pre-planning to finding a place. The last group was extremely so like that. And that became problematic after 5 years. At 5 years, the last group virtually almost destroyed our church. And that was a difficult experience for me personally, and for many of us. The level of hurt they'd experienced, and in the time before they came to us, and as I say, that was a group I didn't know any of the people in the community at all, not one of them. But they'd had such a hard time in their previous church. They had developed some extremely intense loyalties between them. So when they came to us, they were a church coming to a church. And although they tried to mute those loyalties a little bit, and they were great people, really, really wonderful people, but the intensity of their loyalties to each other became, to me personally, very difficult to deal with. But it took 5 years for that to develop. I can't remember what your original question was, Ken.
Well, it was just
focus here.
It was that, asking about how to assimilate it. And this is probably nuts and bolts stuff that pastors would get involved with each other. But I imagine when that group came from the unhealthy, the aberrant, the abusive background, they must have had some, I don't know, you tell me, but was there some unhealthy but recognized leader in that group that came into your church and basically just didn't stop being their leader, or how did they stay together?
In the third case, yes. The last case, definitely. It wasn't, and as I say, these were all great people. To a person, they were wonderful people, in a lot of ways. and their leadership amongst them. It was about 25 people, the last group, and the leadership among them was well established, recognized. They were elders, they were deacons, they were worship leaders. They were, they possessed every chair in their previous church that one could have. and so there was a pretty finely tuned structure there amongst them. They were leaders, no pastors, of course. I immediately went to the pastor of that previous church 3 times, seeking to find out what could I do to get them back to their home, because they had been in that church for many years and had become people of faith in that church. And I thought at first, and the third time, the pastor said to me, "Why do you keep calling me, Neil?" And I was a little surprised to hear that, because they're your people, and I'm not seeking to build our church, on harvesting other churches' people. And he was so done with them, and exhausted himself. And I probably should have taken that signal for some reason, but I didn't, because they came in and they integrated into our ministry, and not in any kind of a weird way. They just came in and naturally started going to stuff and adopting ministries themselves, because they were gifted people. The previous two groups before that, who were just as injured, but had come out of difficult circumstances, had been in other churches for decades themselves, built those churches, loved those churches. Also, they came with a little different flavor. They weren't as sophisticated in their loyalties to each other, and we had absorbed them previously. And there was never a time when we had become known as a healing church, or as a church that was helping people strategically with spiritual abuse issues. We never became known as that. That's just how it unfolded.
So as your ideas like that were developing, did you, and you continued your studies and your focus on this issue, have you ever been accused of kind of countermanding the positivity of Christianity? I mean, why so negative, Neil? Why are we having this conversation today about bad churches? Because we are all about, potlucks and bad coffee and all that stuff.
I'm perpetually seeking good coffee, by the way.
Yeah. But why not just be positive, Neil?
I appreciate that question, because I've given my life to ministry, and not being negative, not wanting to be a critic, not wanting to be sort of a cynical sitter on the hill, always casting doubt about other people's groups and ministries. But you're not in church life very long, I have to say, at least in the times that we live in, when you don't rub up against some weirdness sooner or later. Maybe there are some cities, in fact, tell me one and I'll move there, okay, where everything is all healthy and happy and positive, and there isn't any tension. There are no authority conflicts. There's no egos at stake in the leaders. Tell me where that is, and my wife and I, man, we'll move there, okay, and join that church. But I haven't found that place yet, and church life is risky. It can be, I don't want to say dangerous. That's too negative, but it can be risky. And I just don't have the capability anymore of being entirely positive all the time, if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. It does. I think besides the theological magnificent doctrine of grace, besides that, the sociological experience in these churches seems to be no humor, no fun. No, a real deadly serious approach to Christianity. That describes me when I was in my little shop of horrors. And why do you, and you've written this, why do you emphasize the idea that humor should be a part of a church? Is that a little flaky, or do you wish you were a stand up comedian like most pastors?
I've been called worse. I've been called flaky and worse. And I have I mean, I'm so glad to say something to this, because I don't hear a lot of writers or pastors actually articulate this. And I think it's the deathly silence in church ministries on the question of humor, or at least the word, a fellow taught me this word. I didn't grow up with this word, but it's a great word. An Irish friend of mine taught me the word whimsy. And, I think every church, I think every leadership team, whatever you call your leaders in your church, ought to have somebody on that team who's gifted in the area of whimsy. That kind of person who can bring a lighthearted comment periodically. I'm going to show you all a picture that I'm very proud of. And we actually got in trouble for using this. This is our staff of the church I was at, Christmas card that we sent out in 2015. And we were all very proud of this. The one before this was all of us dressed up in Gilligan's Island costumes on a beach. And this is the one we did in 2015. And we had the best time putting that together. I'm very proud of that. But we got yelled at for it by a few people within our own church who said, you have no business doing that. That's worldly. That's, they were critical of that, which only motivated me even more to, try to go against the tendency that we have to be so harsh. And so that's the older I get, the more I want to find the balance, Ken, in ministry. The church my wife and I attend right now has some potential for a little bit of not whimsy overall. Our ministries are very serious. Our confession, our creedal confessional approach to doctrine and theology and what we're saying is very serious. But there ought to be some moments when you can just lighten up a little bit. Would you please lighten up, Neil? Would you please give us some breathing room here? And that is very important to me. I do an email. I've done this for about 15 years, every week, to a list of a couple of hundred people who like to find out whatever it is I'm thinking about that week. And most weeks I put a link at the end of the email for for Seinfeld, for somebody that I think is funny, a comedy link. And then sometimes there's stand-up comedians, and people look at me like I'm nuts that I do that. But I think part of our humanness is to laugh a little bit. Do you think?
Yeah, it's modeling something that's missing in cults. As you were speaking right there, Neil, I was deciding if our cult would rebuke you and kick you out the door, or whether we would just give you the silent treatment and wait for you to go away.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying. We're getting close to opening up for questions, which I'm really looking forward to. And I really hope all of our guests here today, who I want to say to you, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. I see one note from Mark saying, I like Neil's point about the need for negativity sometimes, a paraphrasing. Did I get that right? Forgive me if I missed something.
And let me just comment that it was a privilege to do the book. The book that we created came out of the conference in 2018 in Hartford, Connecticut, and I, I ended up becoming the editor because at the dinner at the end of the conference of all the leaders, the question went out, who would like to edit this book, and nobody volunteered, and they looked at
We all took a step backwards.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I was there. I said, I guess I can do it, So I don't know how to do it, but we figured it out, and it's been a good book, and it's done pretty well, I think. And it's been a privilege to be involved with that with all the contributors, including Ken.
Thank you, Neil. There it is. Well, everybody probably knows it, but that's it. Okay, I want to read this comment that's on here. I think that's my job. But before that, I just want to address one issue and apologize to not spend near the time on it that we should. But it's an issue, oftentimes in preaching, I kind of remind myself my job is to say things that nobody else is saying in the church, but really needs to be said. And they pay me to say those things. And so I just wondered briefly if you could comment on new revelations and just things that are coming out about the presence of sexual abuse, clergy, parishioner, sexual manipulation and power differentiation abuse, not to mention crimes against children, which is our cult's background. Neil, can you just give us like a 30,000-foot take on that and its effect on the church and what you see happening now?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I'll try to speak
a lot. Sorry. Yeah.
Very, very briefly. I mean, it's a huge problem. It's not going to go away. It seems like as time goes on, especially even recently, more and more revelations are coming to light about abuses that have occurred of all kinds of nature. And this is infuriating to us, and it's frustrating, and it's confusing because we're supposed to be a good community. We're supposed to be communities that are doing good for people, starting with the gospel. I would say that's where we begin. And then we're not supposed to be hurting people, injuring people. And yet this is becoming known more and more. And I think on what part of me is glad that it's becoming unveiled. But it's sad for me that it exists at all. And I don't say that in any measure of arrogance, like I would be, exempt, or I'm a superhero and I'm not capable of abusing somebody. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm just, like you said, the 30,000-foot aerial picture of the whole thing. It's contradictory to what we're about, and it ought to never take place. And we should be embarrassed. And so if a new revelation about some high-profile pastor or ministry comes to light this next week, then we should welcome its uncovering, as long as it's done fairly and accurately. But that, I don't know what else to say other than that. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, it really is. And it might just be that I wanted to name the monkey that's running around in the room in evangelical Christianity, particularly as we begin to see this stuff. And just as a pastor and professionally, I just always want to acknowledge what's going on. And I know you're there, so I just wanted to kind of get your take on it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. I'm going to jump into some questions now, and I welcome everybody to write in questions. I've got a few here, and also anything that we're missing or that maybe you want us to briefly revisit, that is good. And so, yeah, thank you for these. Neil, one of these questions here just says what about the problem that allegedly happened through the concept of toxic positivity in churches and in the ministry, and how they might get in the way of somebody, I don't know, as I think about it, grieving in a healthy way over the true loss that occurs through spiritual abuse. And do you have any thoughts on how to balance out our desire for authenticity and humor, like what we've been talking but also, when does it go toxic? When are you being kind of a skippity-doo-dah guy and not dealing with the tough stuff?
That's a great question, and that is an occupational hazard of ministry in general. And I like that. I think I'm going to borrow that. I think I'm going to steal that. Skippity doo dah. I'm going to write a new book called that.
That's the seminary, the degree, and all that stuff. It just puts these things in my head.
I like that. That's excellent. And that is an occupational hazard of being involved in a ministry that you want to emphasize positive things, growth, healing, finding potential, or we go on and on and on, all the nice little phrases that people use, and balancing that when someone, reality is such that there is potential for growth, and every church ought to be emphasizing that, not beating people down. I think emphasizing spiritual growth, but at the same time, there are obstacles along the way. And it is a tough balance to find. I think that requires the leadership to be mindful of, of the realities just of existing in, first, let's just say church life or ministry life, is that we're gonna have some conflicts sometimes. But overall, what we're seeking is a good thing. We're seeking growth. We're seeking advancement. We're seeking not so much feeling better about ourselves, but we're seeking, me, from my perspective, we're seeking Christian sanctification, basically, that the Lord will help us grow more like Christ. That's ultimately what my goal is, our goal is, and that ought to be the focus. But at the same time, realizing there are going to be obstacles from time to time.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't, I haven't gotten much traction at all from my fellow pastors about spiritual abuse. It's not that they've all failed me and we all love each other and have coffee and all of that, but it doesn't seem to be something that people are wanting to get into the educational structure of their churches. And even when the issue comes into their churches, I'm usually consulted. Somebody is sent to me by a pastor or something like that, or maybe a pastor then asks me, what's going on with this church down here? And so I hear what you're saying about the importance of talking to the congregation before it comes to the door, of saying, I don't know if you would preach through Jude or 2 Peter or Ezekiel 34 or some, primary text on it. But I think you're hitting on something that's important about modeling and talking about the issue before it gets to us, and preparing people to show kindness and understanding when those people come to the door. Okay. There's a question here that says, is the transmission of trauma between and among leaders and members the source of injury and weirdness?
I don't know what that reader or questioner is asking by transmission. If the idea is that it can be infectious, especially within a close-knit leadership team, that is very true. And I don't know if that's what they're aiming at or not. Read the question again, please, Ken.
Is the transmission of trauma between leaders and members of the source of, quote, injury and weirdness? And I imagine this just has something to do with the dysfunction and the narcissism and trouble of an abusive leader, maybe turning other people kind of weird too, and maybe creating some mini narcissists.
That is very true. Let me just say that it can spread, particularly if you've got a sort of an inspirational leader, single leader who maybe began a ministry or took over a ministry and was dominant. Whatever is strange about that person can definitely spread. and be replicated by other leaders in his team. In fact, I wished I didn't have to admit this, but I think we need to have the courage to admit sometimes that's by design. A leader wants other people who will take on his or her weirdness to communicate it further. I mean, that just sounds bizarre that I even have to say that, but I have seen that more than once.
Yeah.
I also want to affirm something you said, Ken, very quickly that you alluded to. This is a hard sell. The topic of spiritual abuse, even just talking about it, let alone trying to deal with it tactically in some way in advance with some forethought, in a church or a ministry. This is a very hard sell. Nobody wants to talk about this.
No.
Pastors don't want to talk about it. I don't think I would have known that 5 years ago, but we've learned that with this book, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you, Neil. There's a question here of what would be your suggestion about how to start a church free of spiritual abuse, composed of survivors?
My goodness, what an intriguing question. And I've actually, the group that came, the last group that came and was with us for 5 years, has subsequently left and created a new church. And now they do not look at themselves as having been really abused. They looked at themselves more as being visionary. But I don't think I'm ready to write the brochure how to do that. That vision to create a new church, when all the builders of the new church have injury they're struggling to heal from, man, that's a tall order. And then I would say if the conviction is we're supposed to do this, there's a strong sense of careful, planning that this is something we really are committed to doing. And then with enough hard work and patience, and then it'll happen. But people that are dealing with, it's like getting a bunch of people coming out of Vietnam and they were injured in battle and trying to create something out of that. You got to deal with those injuries in every case. You can't assume them that they're gone, they're healed. Yeah, I'm just babbling here, but I mean those are my thoughts on that idea.
Yeah.
That's a noble cause.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to prove your courage if you're going to try to start a church, today. But I too I would have to know the people pretty well, because I would have some very hard and pointed questions about why do you want to all stay together, and what is your purpose then of staying together, and is it to heal from what happened to you, and if so, is this the best way to heal, or is your purpose to extend Christ and that into the culture, and why do you feel that you would do that better as a victim-oriented or victim church? So anyway, probably a question that would deserve a lot more discussion with the group.
It's a worthy question. It's definitely a worthy question.
Oh yeah. Because after I left my group, we were trauma bonded for a few years afterwards. We still had every Christmas together, every Thanksgiving, get-togethers constantly. There's about 20 of us constantly with each other, living together, staying up till 3 a.m, telling war stories together. So I get it. I mean, you don't just walk out of these churches and go solo and feel okay. It's a rough road. Someone here mentions that we might suggest the benefits of the book Bully Pulpit by Kruger. And that is a wonderful book that approaches the issue of, I see it as the narcissist in the pulpit, basically, and the effect of of abuse that comes from preachers that are, well, if you have the pulpit once a week and you get to talk and nobody really gets to talk back to you, you are entrusted with a very significant amount of power. You probably say more things than people hear around their dinner table all week. You say more than political leaders say cumulatively, and so the pulpit
It occurs to me, Ken, to comment on this, that I think this is a sacred privilege for a preacher. And he ought to always honor the fact that you people are giving me the privilege to listen to me uninterrupted for 30 minutes or however long the message goes, frequently. And I ought to guard the sanctity of that privilege very carefully and never look at it as a right. I'm the pastor, I'm the leader, I'm the visionary, I'm the prophet. You have to listen to me. That's when the public speaking role goes toxic at that point. Very quick. And I just want to make that comment to that question, that's something I always felt was important to try to communicate to people. This is a privilege you are granting me, and I do appreciate it.
Yeah. I thank you, Neil. I appreciate it. I know we've talked a lot now, and we're going to do these questions, but I do want to respond also to that, in that I feel in the evangelical world, basically Bible people and our particular structures, the role of the preacher it has not been degraded so much, because like we've just mentioned, it's a very significant thing to speak to people and to have that kind of authoritative word and sharing from the Bible. But I think a lot of the authority of the preacher was abused in my education as I studied it, and is even today, through an overemphasis on the power of preaching itself. It is powerful. I mean, it's nuclear, right? But somehow that transfers into a granting of rights and authority to the person who's supposed to be in fear and weakness and much stumbling and trembling. I came to you in Corinth, to speak. It challenges Paul's ideas in that by suggesting that just by being the preacher, you really have some rights to kind of lord it over people. And I wonder, from our perspective, that might be different than a sacerdotal type church or a heavy liturgical church where we have a 15-minute sermon or perhaps a lectionary reading or something. But when you get a guy that has command of 45 minutes or an hour or whatever to just go for it, I just wonder how damaging that is when that is misused and mistreated in people's lives.
I think it can be damaging, and I think it's utterly inappropriate. I mean, my wife and I were in a church service not too long ago with a special speaker, and he spoke for 83 minutes, and he was clearly abusive. And the interesting thing wasn't that the event occurred, it was the scattering around me of people who responded to that kind of public speaking event saying, wasn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Wasn't that prophetic? Man, I needed that. And I thought, you needed to be beat up? You needed to be beat up for a year and a half? I mean, an hour and a half?
Yeah.
How is that reasonable ever?
Yeah. Just the act of taking an hour and a half, and I realized it was only 82 minutes. just the really professional crime of taking that much time from people accords as a victory for the abuser, because you have taken that time. In other words, you could sit there and listen for 82 minutes thinking to yourself, well, this is bull, and this is terrible, and this is abusive, and this is bad. But you don't get up and walk out because you're there, you stay. And so usually it's a he, does steal something and get it, which is in its way an exercise of power. And especially to people that are walking out saying that was a good thing, it's really tragic. Okay, pastors love to beat up on pastors and preachers, so I'll I'll move on
We're
from
gonna have
that.
a good time here, Ken.
Okay. Somebody mentions here in the world of evangelical Christianity, the Roy's Report is a resource that highlights abuse of various forms. That's Julie Roy's from Chicago, and yeah, I've been interviewed by her. I think Doug and Wendy Duncan have, and she's really quite a professional, quite an interviewer, and real nice person. And yeah, thank you for that recommendation. Uh, Someone writes they couldn't agree with you more, and I don't know what that was about, but as a pastor, I'm just going to receive it as an affirmation of my life that that I'm agreed with. Neil, you're good.
We'll take it. We'll take it.
What do you think are the things that cause people to be a part of a group like this, belonging, etc.? And how can their needs be met in a healthy way without tripping over into becoming spiritually abusive yourself? How do you help somebody? They need your intensive work and love and care, but how do you not get into that area where you're, I don't know, maybe abusing them?
Yeah, I mean that's an intelligent question. I think and the word that pops into my head in responding to that is almost overused today, but it's still a good word: boundaries. I need to know my own boundaries. I need to know what I cannot fix. So, Ken, if you come to me as a friend and you've got some issue in your life and you're all messed up about this thing, and you pour your heart out, and reveal your struggle, I need to understand how I might be able to help you and how I can't help you. And maybe that's where teamwork on a leadership team becomes very relevant, is that I can defer certain needs to other people who are more gifted or more available, or less dangerous. There were people who came to me with needs occasionally over the years, and how I handled the thing probably was dangerous or felt dangerous, not because I was trying to be abusive mindfully at all, but just, boundaries is a real important issue, I think,
Yeah,
in people work in general.
yeah,
And
yeah.
there are all kinds of safety mechanisms in place in education, in business, to protect people. But boundaries here with this question is real critical, I think, to help the helper understand what he's really capable of addressing.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil. This kind of leads us into an area that I'm excited to address and try not to talk too much, but this is really important. I am often asked. I've done a little teaching in the seminaries here in town, and I am often asked, what can seminaries do about these abusive leaders? And here's the question that relates really wonderfully to that musing there. Here's the question. I don't know if this is the case in North America, but a problem in Europe is that folks can go through Bible college and become pastors without going through a personal therapy in order to make sure they don't show narcissistic, abusive behavior or character. And so then they become abusive in their churches. And here is sometimes there's no, here, and I'm thinking we're speaking of Europe, there's sometimes no way to keep them in check. So I think the underlying question here, and my answer was not appreciated because it was on a seminary podcast, I think, but and I don't think everybody in our group today would probably agree. And so, but regardless of my answer, the question is so absolutely critical. What role do seminaries play, and how can they play in addressing the narcissistic personality disorder who has chosen the low-hanging fruit of leadership in our culture, be a pastor, and is pursuing that. Where do you go with that if you're a seminary teacher or whatever?
That's a thing that and I wish we had an hour and a half to talk about that. I wish we had some seminary people to talk about that with, because I don't think seminaries are particularly interested. And part of that is not their fault so much as they've got a wide range of topics they're trying to address through their curriculum. My seminary had field education and spiritual development a little bit thrown in there. I think one of the things that for me in my seminary that was extremely strategic was I had one class in 4 years in the Master of Theology program, one single class in counseling. And it was the best class of my entire seminary career. It was taught by a medical doctor, by a psychiatrist. And he flagged so many potential problems psychiatrically, psychologically, that we were going to face, that I thought, man, this really what I want to go into? Because there are going to be so many issues. But that was one class out of 4 years addressing reality, basically. I don't think, and your question wasn't just about counseling in general issues or psychological health. You're asking, what about narcissism? What about how do we prepare our young ministers or leaders for the future? How do we alert them, or how do we minister to them in a way that they do not become abusers? I don't know a seminary. We've got Pat Knapp here joining us today, and I don't know if Pat, if you've just to acknowledge that you're here with us. Is there a seminary anywhere that even acknowledges these things as potential problems? I don't know a seminary that does in their curriculum.
Not in their curriculum. I know of a seminary, my local seminary, their director of counseling was groomed by a narcissist fellow professor to start a church with him, and that narcissist is in all kinds of trouble now and out of the ministry. And that's the director of the counseling department.
Oh, wow.
Who was the associate pastor.
That's so sad. But clearly, if anybody were to come to us and say, talk to us about how we can, at least address this, we would have a few things to say, wouldn't we?
Yeah. I think, Pat, I want to, if we can have you address this, would be great. I just want to say, I said, and this is what got me in trouble, I said seminaries can't do that. Narcissists are smarter than all of us. They are amazing predators. They operate by instinct. And at the age of 20 years old or 22 years old, a narcissist going to seminary doesn't even know that he is a master of getting through the whole program. He might be the #1 graduating student and the most godly student in the seminary. And so just briefly where I ended up with it, and this is after a couple of years of thinking about it, I think the answer might be for seminaries to really start emphasizing the training of their students in recognizing the narcissistic personality disorder, and training pastors to train congregations to recognize malignant leadership qualities and how to react to them, how to confront, how to vote with your feet, but how to see it and do something about it, as opposed to weeding them out in the seminary process. Pat, if I can get you to where you can talk to us, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. We would love to hear it. And let me see, can you speak to us, Pat? Good.
Yes, absolutely. I just posted a note. I would very much welcome the opportunity to speak to a class, seminary class, or a college class, Christian or otherwise, on this topic of religious abuse and recovery. That is a huge desire of mine. I've reached out to several schools. I won't mention their names, but unfortunately, I haven't gotten any kind of positive responses. One school suggested maybe, but I've not heard anything further, and that's been a couple months now. But I would gladly, absolutely, delightfully want to teach a class, and I have a syllabus already prepared. I'm all good to go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Pat.
I would love to hear from others. If you know of any school, whether it would require an online sort of instruction or in person, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah. I wonder if
it ought to be addressed. It ought to be addressed. I know
Yeah.
Bob Harden teaches occasionally at Reformed Episcopal in Philadelphia. And it's very, very, very small school. So at least there's some presence, not about narcissism in particular, but cults in general. But yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat. Thank you for joining us on that response. I really appreciate it. I know of the work that you have done, writing a thesis, publishing a book, and being prepared to teach like that. So that's kind of a maybe that emphasizes that we're really in the initial baby stages as Christians. And I'm not assuming I know everybody's faith in this on this screen in front of me, but just the Christian church is really in its baby phases of grappling with this issue and figuring out how to do it. Gut feeling here is that we're still thinking we can educate ourselves out of it, and we're not really understanding the processes of character formation, malignant psychopathy, and just, we're dealing with real stuff here that universities and big academic people have treated. And we're not just going to have a Bible study to increase our devotional life to deal with a false teacher. We have to understand it from a psychotherapy standpoint, and we haven't quite done that yet.
I think if there was one question that could be asked of the first year class of a ministry training school, a seminary or a Bible college or something, you ask the question, why do you want to do this? And have that pushed to the person pretty heavily. Why do you want to go into this line of work? What is driving you? Examine your motives, examine your passions, or whatever, word you want to use there. But really, they should be pressed. I was never pressed that way. Nobody ever said, why do you want to do this? And I think that's a pretty deep question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's a question I would compel people to answer and think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's some suggestions, I think, that are on your screens to everyone about resources available. Pat's resources on there, Becoming Free, and a very helpful program in Redcliffe College, UK, out of All Nations Bible College. So there are some resources out there. I guess, and maybe we'll move on if there's more to talk about here, but something that occurs to me when you're a seminary student, and I don't just mean a counseling student or a missions student, because these are different personalities going this way. But if you're somebody who's actually saying, you know what, I want to pursue this education because I want to stand up in front of people once a week and feel like I'm in my underwear in that dream, you show up in math class in your underwear or something. I want to have that horrible, vulnerable experience once a week. If you're that kind of person who's showing up at the door, you are so powerfully influenced by your teachers and instructors and theological things that more than books and videos and that, it's somebody getting face to face with you and knowing you and speaking straight to you about this thing in you. And then secondly, I believe it's critical that pastors especially become very adept at rejecting people from the ministry. I mean, we don't diagnose. We can't say this person has narcissistic personality disorder, but we can say professionally, as a pastor here, I won't give my blessing to this, to you continuing on in ministry for this reason, and this reason.
And that has a
generally
price
speaking-
tag associated with it, Ken.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Price tag there is that if that person, that applicant, has a loyal following around them, then, and you are dissing them or is perceived to be that, or rejecting their pursuit of a vocation here in ministry, that the price tag can be pretty stiff.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's quite a big issue, and probably is tied into the reticence we find in seminaries, denominations, and churches to really kind of call a spade and say this is a destructive person. And every pastor and counselors see it all day long, but every pastor has a church in which volunteer leaders are bona fide narcissistic abusers. And hopefully that pastor addresses that issue, whether it's through political means or directly relieving somebody of a ministry, but whatever. When you see one, if you think of your church as a flock, and you see one sheep that's goring the other sheep and hurting them, that's part of your job. So we all know it when we see it. And if you're a good pastor, you act on what you see. And I sense what we're thinking here is, how do we tell the other the seminaries or other institutions to act and to do their part of the thing too? Pat, were you thinking of something?
No, I don't know that I have an answer to that. I wish I did, because frankly, an awful lot of, sadly, what I've heard over the years is that, as you and Neil have suggested, an awful lot of the time, particularly evangelical organizations, don't want to hear about religious abuse. So I wish I had an answer.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, if anybody out there in Radio Land has an answer, we're all ears. It's a lot of work, and maybe it's just one of those things like the New Testament church, made up of little huddled groups of 40 or 50 slaves and Jews and Gentiles and all that. And maybe the answer lies in building a healthy family systems type structure in your church that actually loves and respects people, all people. Maybe we just have gotten a little big for our britches in doing that.
To me, the phrase I've used over and over again before I retired a lot, detecting this, is power and influence. And that is the commodity that is used to fuel abuse. Is a leader or a group of leaders are afforded too much power and influence. And those are different things, by the way. If if a leadership team makes a decision about making a change in the music of a church, let's say, that's power. They have the power to do that. Influence is a whole different thing, but those two together are really the fuel, I think, for that drives narcissism and the basic psychology of a brokenness that a leader might have embedded within his psyche. That's a commodity too that we've spoken about here today. But power and influence that is a slippery, I almost want to say a squirrely kind of thing that people get in churches. It needs to be talked about. Who has the power and influence? It might not even be the leaders or the pastor. It might be somebody else, the richest person in the church, or the person that's been there for 50 years. They have longevity. They have all the power and influence. I mean, that's something that ought to be at least talked about.
Mhm.
Anyway, I wanted to mention that one.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, yeah, and especially for small churches, the pastor has such tremendous power. I know there are small churches that are family run and control the pastor and all that, but that's usually a young pastor fresh out of school. But if you hang around long enough, people are transitioning in and out. You've got a small church. You are just going to be making decisions about money, and that's very challenging, especially if you're suspicious of that idea, like I am. Let me ask some questions because some new ones have appeared here. And thank you, Abby. This question is, how do you have clear selection criteria that means you can avoid charming narcissists slipping through without having diagnoses? What does it look like in terms of behavior? How to have tests or situations that would make it clearer, etc. And then a side note here, personality tests could be useful. So the idea is, can we catch an abusive leader before they can do much abusing? Do you see that being able to happen?
I think that is definitely a thing that can be filtered out or screened for. In our church, what we sought to do was to, before someone could join our senior leadership team, which we called elders in our church, they had to sit with us for 3 years, a minimum of 3 years. And that, you put that kind of a probationary mechanism in place. I don't think a narcissist is going to tolerate that. He wants immediate gratification. Or I don't know if that's true or not, but it always felt like that. It felt healthy to say, look, we recognize in you some potential. We think you've got esteem here, and we're going to give you a shot at using some gifts that you have. But it's going to, you're not even going to be official with us for at least 3 years. And so that was one thing we did to try to help filter that out in advance. Not always sort of cynically looking for toxic people, but just as a safeguard. And if you're willing to come and sit with us for at least 3 years and be part of all that we're doing, the Mr. Nice Guy is going to go away pretty quickly. It's not going to take a year even, because reality is going to be setting in, and we're going to find out what you're about, and you're going to find out what we're about too. So that was the thing we did that I think was fairly productive.
Yeah. Most narcissists, at least in the studies that I looked at a couple of years ago, very few narcissists enter and complete a therapeutic regime with a licensed, properly trained counselor and all of that, which I'm certainly not. But when they get in the door, what brings them in the door are things like a son who's started shoplifting or smoking pot, or marital trouble or something like that. It's not I'm coming to see you because I'm feeling I might be a narcissist. And it's usually an adjunct thing, maybe frequent trips to the emergency room with anxiety attacks, and a doctor kind of goes, what you need to do is talk to someone. So very few of them, I believe, seek or complete their treatment, which means at that younger age, I see the point. If you could catch it there, it involves all kinds of trouble. Legally, I would imagine, a seminary's not going to refuse somebody and say, we're going to not let you go to seminary or be a pastor because we feel like in 20 years you're going to ruin 200 lives or something. It's kind of tricky.
When I applied to seminary and got admitted to seminary, and I don't know if they still do this or not, and it might sound anachronistic, but every first year student took the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And the only reason I even remember that, it's just so cool to say, the Minnesota
I was impressed.
Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And then you took it again in your 4th year. And the wife, if you had a wife, she took it too. And then you sat down with a counselor and he sort of walked through what I call the star charts, the findings. And that was at least an attempt to, and that was funny because it was, I laugh. I think it's funny because they looked at me and they said, "You are obsessive compulsive 2/3." I said, "What do you mean?
Aren't you like a rocket engineer or something?"
I was an engineer, and they said that is so typical of applicants to our seminary that we get these obsessive compulsive people that want to come to our school. And I thought, I am not that, but so that's why I think it's funny. But at least it was an attempt to chart, or at least to take at least one look, and they did it twice at that time, beginning and end of your seminary experience.
Yeah.
To look at a little bit of the psychology of the person. I remember being impressed with that.
Yeah. Thank you. We have Pat left us, by the way, and so thanks for being here when you were, Pat, and he's gone now. Abby writes, I don't even know if I'm supposed to be saying your names. My apologies if I'm not. Anyway, Abby writes also, how do we structure things so that it doesn't reward narcissisms? Perhaps not having a long sermon led by one person, or how do we set up a structure that keeps the narcissist from getting his supply through the ministry?
Don't give the pastor special parking space.
Mm-hmm.
That was always a pet peeve of mine. That when I would go to another church and the clergy has a special space. Now I always liked that when I would go to a hospital visit, but the pastor shouldn't be, the leadership shouldn't be celebrated so much that it feeds into this mentality, whether it's full-blown narcissism or whether it's just guys just full of himself. Which I think is a little different than a disorder, but I spit that one out just spontaneously about the parking space because it's symptomatic of a mindset that a congregation can have, and it's not necessary. That doesn't contribute anything.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil. I think that's really important, to not have a systemic reward that makes one Christian more important than another.
Yes. Now it can go too far. It can go too far, so that what I call a backdraft syndrome, which is we got to make sure that pastor or those leaders are all the time humble, and we're going to beat the tar out of them regularly. So
don't pay them much. Don't.
Yeah, I mean, the pendulum can go too far the other way too.
Yeah. There's a little bit of a follow-up to Abby's question, and Abby, thank you for graciously letting me say your name since I said it without permission. She continued on with the discussion, suggesting maybe making the sermon, and I assume that's what we're talking about here, making it more interactive, being open to other views people may have, recognizing they don't have absolute truth. And this, I mean, this is not hyperbole. It really is true. I simply have visited or been in very few churches where a person was coming up to the pastor and saying, "Hey, that doesn't count for me," or I preached once and I said something about being mentally ill or crazy or something. It was just one of these side things and didn't mean to hurt anybody. And a guy come up afterwards and say, "I've been on medication for 12 years that saved my life because I have a mental illness." And I wasn't, jumping up and down at the time with joy, but I am so glad that somebody said that to me, because I never said that again. I never humiliated myself again by saying it. So that's a good thing. I mean, that's a good story about me, but I've certainly got some bad ones too. Maybe making, having a structure in place to pull down the sermon or the preacher, which can happen through anonymous feedback too. That might be a good thing too. Another person here says every church should teach on manipulation and mind control and have safeguards. Absolutely. I think everybody would just kind of give a thumbs up about that. I always do my teaching through the Bible, where I would teach a little series on Jude or Second Peter and some of those things I mentioned, and then relate it to life today. But lately I've been noticing people really want me to cut to the chase and talk about what I do with the International Cultic Studies Association, the meetups. They want to hear the words narcissism, because suddenly then they're going, oh yeah, I know, and so I stay biblical with it, but I've just noticed there's a real crying need for me to jump right to the chase and talk about abusive leaders and not just in the church, but traumatizing people.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a tricky balance. Too much specificity can become dangerous. But at the same time, glossing over stuff and a sort of sugarcoating stuff when the troops out there have suffered some true injury by some leader, that doesn't serve the public interest either. There's a tricky balance there of how to speak about narcissism, let's say, in a leader honestly and in a meaningful way, without opening ourselves to libel suits or something. I don't know. It's tricky. I think it's tricky to speak effectively about some of these problems. The whole question, and I don't mean to take our discussion to another department that's very controversial, but just as an illustration, the whole question of how husbands treat wives. I don't mean just in ministry, I mean in general.
Yeah.
That's not an easy, I don't think that's an easy thing to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't diminish the significance of how it ought to be talked about. It ought to be spoken to. So that's just an illustration of the same thing. This is not easy to talk about.
No, that's really true. And many abusive churches, or at least in our world, are a type of harsh and hard complementarianism, if that's not too much of a big word to just kind of throw out, but the idea of men having a sense of rule over women simply based on gender, and the denial of opportunity. You can probably tell I'm an egalitarian by how I talk about it, but a mark of fundamentalism in Islam, Jewish, studies, Christianity, is that gender distinction that sometimes is abused to make abusers. And so wherever we stand on that issue, we should be working hard to take care of everybody and not be abusers about that. I mean, what does it say about our belief if it somehow lets us hurt people?
And that is an excellent summary right there of this whole webinar, Ken. That's well said, my friend.
Thank you. We've got just a couple of minutes here, and I'm going to try to kind of lift us out of the heaviness here, because we're going to say goodbye, and I want to say thank you to everybody. Make sure I look at all your faces here.
I'm lifting us out of the heaviness here. Okay.
Thank you. I feel like I should show my Willie Mays picture behind me here and lift us out with some joy there. But Neil, what, just one serious question, and then I want to end with a question, because I know you're a music aficionado and that you are a man of the 60s.
That's true.
And I just got one more message. Let me address that, because I don't want to. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I don't want to ignore somebody's question here. But one question, just a brief answer here. Can a church go off the rails for a season and then recover. Have you seen that?
Yes. I wished I'd seen it more than I've seen it. I almost think it's likely most churches will go off the rails, at least independent churches. Now, churches that are strongly connected to other churches or some tradition, hopefully have some safeguard in place. But I almost think that it's likely a lot of churches are going to go off the rails on one issue or another. Because why do I say that? That sounds pessimistic. I say that because we're humans. We're broken people, and we're also sometimes pretty gullible. So if Ken, you're in Portland, Oregon, if some doctrinal newness, weirdness swept through your city, that never happens, does it? I mean, that if that were to happen, which I'm old enough to have seen a number of things like this in various places, spiritual trendiness, things that happen, and you say, hey, this is where we're going to go, man. This is where the Lord wants us to get plugged into this, and you do, and then you have second thoughts, and you go, man, that's weird. That's really crazy. I mean, so I mean that can happen, with all sorts of trendy stuff, because we're broken people. We're not totally strong and full of confidence about what is stable and healthy all the time. So I almost think it's almost natural that we might go off the rails, and hopefully eventually we right ourselves. I have seen that happen. Usually it's about the subject of legalism, where a church feels like, we need to tighten up with our behavior. We're getting a little too loosey-goosey. So we're going to put some rules in place. And before you know it, the rules they've put in place have become the laws of the Medes and Persians, and people can't breathe. And so they maybe it takes 10 years or 15 years, but the people are hurting under this heavy legalism. And sooner or later, the leadership, whoever that is, gets a hold of themselves. I have seen that happen, yes.
Yeah. I think it's pretty rare for a leader to stay in his or her position if they have been exposed of abusing people. And I don't just mean the sexual type, money and sex type stuff. Of course, you need to go. You should not continue to lead people when you've done that to them. But it's pretty rare for a person to give up power repentantly. They usually keep it. Okay, we're getting just to the last couple minutes. Neil, are you a Spotify man?
I don't maintain playlists, but I'm very opinionated about music, and I listen to all kinds of people and all kinds of musicians, and I could go on for hours and hours about that.
Okay.
My wife is a Spotify person, but I'm not on it myself.
Were you seduced by the Jezebel of disco in the 70s? Did you make it out of it okay, or did they get you?
I have to confess to my confessor here today, I loved the Bee Gees.
Well,
and what, there's no explanation for that, but yes, I did love the Bee Gees.
Yeah, I wouldn't admit it at the time, but I hear what you're saying. Okay, just before we say goodbye, best concert you've ever been to, Neil?
Jefferson Airplane.
What year?
Which maybe you've never heard of them. I don't know, but
it's West Coast here, man. Yeah, I've heard of that.
Okay, 1970.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I want to thank everybody who has joined us here, because it is a Saturday, it's a weekend, and you have chosen to talk about some heavy, gnarly, nasty things with the broken bride of Christ. And thank you so much for that investment. It does mean a lot. I wish you all blessings, and I wish you all the best. And especially Neil, Erica digs Jefferson Airplane, White Rabbit. And but Neil, especially, we want to thank you for opening up your life, your ministry, and just kind of giving us a window into that, and especially for your magnificent work of making us all famous, all of us writers, by compiling this wonderful book. Thank you, my
It's
friend.
been a privilege.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks a lot. I don't know how we sign off, but thank you very much. God bless you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for participating. If you're interested in continuing to support ICSA, please join or donate at icsahome.com/membership.